gentlemen, as well join us in the room, friends and colleagues. I want to welcome you to the third day of the CEPS Ideas Lab, which is dedicated to the EU's industrial strategy. And we already had a session this morning presenting a report that is going live now on the CEPS website that we have worked on since the beginning of the year, or actually since the end of last year. And the report already sends quite a clear message to the European Commission on the need to be ambitious, on the need to be bold, on the need to be courageous in looking at the future for the European industry. The report contains 105 recommendations on a variety of different sectors, from the end policy areas, from the Green Deal to the digital transition, to agriculture, to trade, to many, many others. And the idea is that we face the challenge of having to build not only back better, but back much better, because indeed there is no state of grace to get back to. Even if we go back to the pre-pandemic period, there is no, really hailing the system that we had and the approach to capitalism that we had as really conducive to the medium-term vision that we have for society that is expressed so well by the Sustainable Development Goals and that has been embraced by the von der Leyen Commission since the very beginning. Now, as you know, in the very famous 100 days since the inception of the von der Leyen Commission, Commissioner Breton in particular presented a first vision for the EU industrial strategy. And this vision was to some extent aligned with the ambition of the Green Deal and with the Sustainable Development Goals. But it lacked governance, it lacked to some extent an overall vision, it lacked some cohesiveness in our opinion, and most importantly, it was completely disrupted by the pandemic. So the European Commission since then has been working on several initiatives, and in particular on updating the EU industrial strategy, a communication that came out recently. At the same time, the Commission has been mostly, if you wish, in protective mode, meaning most of the communication issued by the Commission is about how do we defend and protect the single market? How do we defend Europe by mapping strategic dependencies vis-a-vis other parts of the world and other countries in the world? But the strategy, in the opinion of many commentators, including I believe many of the ones that are connected today, was lacking a little bit of a vision, an overall mission. And we have in our work started to identify what this vision could be. And we found work inside the European Commission to start building a vision for the future of EU industry, which would be built around a human-centric approach to technology. Importantly, an industry and its supply chains that are oriented towards resilience over time, and chiefly important also oriented towards overall sustainability. So the Industry 5.0 paradigm is still at the very embryonic stage inside the European Commission, in particular inside DG Research and Innovation. It will be discussed today in this session along with other things. Now, the question is, this vision also somehow requires that the EU institutions look at the role of the private sector and the responsibility and that the private sector has in driving the transition, alongside with the public institutions and with all stakeholders. But the issue here is the private sector cannot be an elephant in the room in this transition. It cannot be a sort of a bystander in this transition. No transition towards resilience and sustainability can happen if the private sector and all the framework conditions that should be conducive for the private sector to drive change, if the private sector does not embrace this vision. So this is a little bit what we want to discuss today, and whether the Industry 5.0 approach can be the North Star for the EU industrial strategy, whether the private sector is well equipped and also finance and our approach to capitalism more generally rewards virtuous behavior in the business community, and really drives the business community towards an alignment with the goals that we as a society have set for ourselves for the medium term. And in order to do this, I will be accompanied today by four magnificent speakers, of which I'm very happy to have all of them. The fourth, Jean-Éric Paquet, will join us only in an hour towards the end of our session. But we have three phenomenal speakers today. And I want to start, I will introduce them as they take the floor, but I want to start with Sandrine. Sandrine Dixson-Declève has many different positions, is a very well-known expert practitioner and commentator of topics related to the transition towards sustainability and resilience, and to everything that deals with people, planet, and prosperity. She is the co-president of the Club of Rome. She has many other positions, but the one I want to mention is that she's chairing the ESIR group. And the ESIR group is an advisory group to the European Commission DG Research and Innovation, devoted to the economic and societal impacts of research and innovation. Sandrine will say more in her presentation about this, but what I want to say is that this ESIR group, you'll see this on screen in a couple of minutes, is a phenomenal group of 15 people. I'm the only ordinary human being in there. The other ones are superheroes for me. And of the superheroes, Sandrine is the one that leads us and gives us energy, enthusiasm, direction, leadership. And so I'm super happy to have her introduce the conversation that we're going to have today. So Sandrine, I will give you the floor. I will put on your slides, and we'll take it from there. So over to you.
Wonderful.
And thanks for the introduction to the
Thank you so much, Andrea, and thank you to Sharan Burrows and to Emmanuel Faber for joining us today. Because as you and I crafted this session together, we really felt that it was important for people to realize that there's a lot going on in terms of new thinking in Industry 5.0. And in fact, through the ESIR group, as you indicated, we, for the last 2 years when we were first set up, have been thinking about how COVID has really impacted the way in which we look at industry's role in society, but also how we tap into the new consciousness post-COVID of what is truly essential. And so what we wanted to do, and I don't know if you can see the slides, there we go. What we wanted to do today was to really have a deep conversation around how can we truly shift industry and bring industry on board, as you indicated so well, to be a participant in the co-design of what we need to protect, prepare, and transform Europe. This is the motto of the ESIR group, the experts that have worked together. We have published actually 2 briefs, and those are both online on the European Commission website. The focus of those briefs being very much on ensuring that we protect people, planet, and prosperity together, that we don't just focus on growth, but that we actually truly look at the synergies in the 3 and how we can create an economy of well-being, or an economy that truly is fundamentally built on prosperity for all within the planetary limits. The other is to prepare better for future crises. And we will be speaking about the disruption of the value chain, which we all know and have seen so clearly, but also how do we actually prepare for multiple crises at the same time. We've just seen the pandemic, but we will have continuous crises. And at the Club of Rome, for the last 50 years, we've always said there will be a series of crises, not just one. And then the last and most important point is that within this preparation, how do we then start to put in place the short-term levers for change? How do we transform society, economy, and regenerate the planet? How do we ensure that we do that by creating lives and livelihoods for people, but also being totally in respect of the other species that are living on this planet, and ensuring that actually we have a planet to live on? So if you look at the next slide, and the way in which we've been looking at this planetary emergency and these tipping points, we clearly have been thinking about through ESIR, but also in many other groups that are working together now. What does the 21st century well-being economics look like? What does that actually signify? And I've actually published a paper on this, but there are many others who are thinking about not only just well-being economies, for, by the way, we have 5 of them across the globe, but also pluralistic economies. What type of economies are starting to look at the combination of different indicators? And we know that in order to do that, we need to think about decoupling. And decoupling is completely linked to the way in which we consume and we produce. So what we need to do, and this is one of the papers that you, Andrea, and others have started to look at, was the role of Industry 5.0 in terms of the way in which we decouple our impact. And if you go to the next slide, you can see that already we need to think within the donut. We need to think within a systems approach. And we need to address the failings that we have seen through COVID and in other times, the financial crisis and other crises, to not be able to secure people's lives and livelihoods, and also to secure a healthy planet. So if you go to the next slide, part of the work that we've been doing at the Club of Rome, but working with others such as Systemic, is to start to see what are those key ecosystems that we need to preserve. What is most essential? Healthy food, built environment, intermodal mobility, and consumer goods. And ensuring that across the board, we look at all of those nascent industrial champions, those value chains that we really need to enhance and make most resilient. And if you look at the last slide, the way we start to do that is to see the integrated approach of that system roadmap. And this is what we mapped out for President von der Leyen and the European Commission, as you well know. But it is also fundamentally what we're starting to think through in our Industry 5.0. Because what Industry 5.0 says from an ISEER perspective and from the work that we've been thinking about is the first, we've seen signs of a triple failure within the COVID-19 planning. A failure to protect workers, the environment, and the economy, a failure to prepare the economy for unforeseen disruptions, and a failure to transform the paradigm of the global value chains towards sustainable practices. But what we've also seen at this time is actually that there has been a stronger interest in those companies and those investments that go towards environment, social, and governance practices, so what we call the ESG indicators. What we've also been thinking, though, in order to ensure that we have more investments that go to the right place, that we have more of this systemic implementation that we so need, and that we truly start to invest in those development opportunities across these most important ecosystems or economic activities, is that we need some key principles. And this is part of our next analysis within Industry 5.0 that we are doing together. Stronger technological sovereignty. Europe has to play a stronger role in the global development of digital, environmental, and health technologies. Technology for resilience and sustainability. Technology that can be good for people, the planet, and prosperity, and ensuring that we have the taxonomies, the underpinning financial system to give the right signals to invest in those technologies. Decentralized production of essential items. Decentralization is absolutely crucial. And the work that I'm doing now for the UN Food Systems Summit is even looking at how can we ensure food for all people? How can we decommodify food, as we know food is an essential good? We also need to look at redundancy rather than mere shortening of value chains. What are those value chains that we need to get rid of? The mandatory due diligence of value chains. And again, we know through COVID that it is those value chains that were de-risked for ESG principles that are the ones that receive the most investment. But very importantly, part of the conversation that we've been having is ensuring that we have governance flexibility and agility, that we put in place a reduction of bureaucratic principles that are stopping for investments in the right value chain, in the right industrial proposals. We also need to ensure that we align investments towards a new approach to capitalism. And for us, capitalism should almost be a brand new thinking around not necessarily degrowth, but not necessarily a growth prospect. So ensuring that we go beyond GDP that we think about any growth has to be linked to people, planet, and prosperity once again, securing us as human beings within the planetary boundaries and ensuring that we are active participants in a well-being economy. And then meaningful progress setting. And what we also say within our compass is a new leadership, ensuring that the old motto in public policy is what gets measured gets done actually does happen, that we start to ensure that we measure again against performance for people, planet, and prosperity. So for me, and for those within the ASEER group, but if we look at the broader spectrum now, the work that Foresight is doing in the European Commission on new indicators, if we look at these economies that have done so well, who have invested in well-being indicators, we know that actually also through the ESG growth tripling, if not quadrupling of investments over COVID, that this is the right way to move forward. Now, together, we need to ensure that. And that's why it's so important that we have both Sharan and Emmanuel here to share with us both the worker's point of view, but also Emmanuel's incredible perspective on what it's like to be a CEO, trying to do the right thing, and realizing that you're constrained and your hands are tied by a financial system that is not changing in order to shift towards that paradigm that we need. So I'll leave it to you now, Andrea, in terms of the next steps, and I look forward to having a conversation with both Sharan, yourself, and Emmanuel.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sandrine. I think this perfectly presents the breadth and the scope of our discussion for this session. I might have a sort of a quick follow-up question for you, and perhaps to sort of warm up the discussion as we move to Emmanuel in a minute, which is you have been very heavily involved in the taxonomy discussion inside the European Commission, right? Do you think that was a missed opportunity? I know you've been quite vocal about it, and do you think it can be remedied in the short term? And I don't know if you have quick suggestions and ideas about this, because I think this could prepare us very well for our discussion with Emmanuel.
Yeah, very good question, Andrea, and absolutely. In fact, I was just quoted yesterday again in your active on this very point. I think the taxonomy was truly the most comprehensive potential proposal to put in place green criteria for new investment. And I think it is a missed opportunity because what happened is the science-based recommendations that were put forward were obviously too ambitious for some countries, in particular in the area of forestry, bioenergy, gas, and nuclear. And I think that this is a little bit where the rubber hits the road. This is where we need to realize if we are going to put in place policy making which is comparable to the science and to the ambition needed to really curtail the planetary emergency, then we do need to truly decide what is green and what isn't. What is actually comparable to climate neutrality and what is not. And I think that after 2 years of so many experts working together from the investment community, from the business community, NGOs, scientific experts like myself, economic experts and others, coming together, the EIB, ECB, OECD, EEA, etc., putting forward these recommendations and then seeing that the political bartering weakened those recommendations to compliance-based system is really a shame. Now, I caveat that with the fact that just recently the European Commission has announced that it will change some of the governance and that there will be greater exchange between the experts and member states before we actually get to the delegated act proposals. I think that's very positive and that's absolutely necessary as we move forward. And I think we need to take this experience to realize that anything that comes in now, whether it be Industry 5.0, it's not to replace Industry 4.0. Any taxonomy is not just to replace ESG or what we have. It is going far beyond to match the emergency at hand. And that is the key crux of what we need to discuss and what we need to do to move forward.
Thanks a lot, Sandrine. Yes, we will try not to, as you're doing, not to just be disappointed but what happens, but to really multiply our efforts to push the EU institutions towards more courage and perhaps leading all the other stakeholders towards something that is reasonably ambitious, because it is time to be bold and ambitious, and the sense of urgency is something that we want to convey today, because we as scientists and as researchers perceive it, right? I will turn to Emmanuel. Emmanuel, you've been evoked already several times, and we are very happy that you're with us. You, Emmanuel, have had a long career in Danone. You've been CEO and chair. You have tried to bring about a very substantial change. You actually managed to do it, because you brought Danone into also the new regime of entreprise à mission, which is a very encouraging development. Indeed, the idea to invite Emmanuel together with Sandrine came at the time in which I was reading a book called Impact by Sir Ronnie Cohen that has basically a chapter dedicated to Emmanuel, and but obviously was written little bit before things started to turn a little bit more complicated in his adventure at Danone. So I think you have a unique perspective, Emmanuel, for us to really share from your point of view what really should be changed and what really is not consistent in our push towards a better future. So the floor is yours, and thanks again for being with us.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, everyone, for having me. I guess maybe to come back to what you said earlier, which was the question of the role of the financial markets, large businesses. Maybe I can thread my own speech around what Sandrine has said as well. Basically, I think that we will have an alignment on the financial markets and their ability to finance and support the right models if we have regulation and KPIs, indicators, that create the right incentives, directly and indirectly. In a way, it is as simple as that. I'll just give you one perspective, which is that we realized that for Danone as a food company, agriculture was so important, soil health was so important for the long term, that we decided 10 years ago, 15 actually, to start measuring our CO2. We developed a module with SAP that allowed us to do this. And the first thing we did was in 2009 to have the 15,000 team leaders of Danone worldwide to be incentivized not only on the profit and the market shares and whatever, but also on the reduction of the CO2 footprint of their brands, of their product, their factory, whatever. Well, we took it to a broader way when in 2019, when we peaked our global scope 3 emissions, we also decided to release a new indicator to the financial market, which was an earning per share adjusted of the carbon cost, the total emissions of Danone and the cost. And it was very interesting because it provided us an opportunity to discuss with our investors that if our dividend was going to exceed this limit, it would mean that we would return cash to them before this cash has actually financed the full cycle of its own resilience. In other words, we would start borrowing on the health of soil in 3, 4, 5, 10 years down the road, and therefore on the future dividends of the shareholders. And we continue to do that. So I can tell you it was received very, very positively because it really established a clear link between the business long-term performance and this ESG example in this case. So the one thing I would say is that establishing the right incentive, and you need to establish the right KPIs, and this will allow, I'm very clear, to resynchronize the financial markets with what industry business needs to do, as you said, as the elephant in the room, to serve the broader society properly for better resilience and inclusiveness. So to that end, I think we should fully support the work of the task force of EFRAG right now, which is working on the ESG metrics for the EU companies by the end of this year. It's fundamental that we do that because we have a different model from the one from our US friends. And I would circle back to Industry 5.0, which I think is a great, the report is a great opening and really need to be commended. But really the point for me will be, we will be true, and this report will be true to being human-centric, sustainable and resilient if we adopt for Industry 5.0 KPIs and indicators that are broader than GDP, for instance, or the traditional way to measure innovation, like the number of patents or the productivity gains, etc., etc. The second point, that's about sustainability. The second point about resilience. We tend to have this point that we are something special in nature. There is nature and there is us. But as I guess Marshall Salins says, human nature is a Western illusion. Nature is us and we are nature. And in many ways, nature works for us, many, many ways. And I'd like to comment on the fact that too often, even in my own company, I see innovation as sort of, we human are clever enough to bring solutions to problems caused by the nature of things. Whereas actually, it's not only about doing mimicking, it's really about creating new alliances with nature instead of fighting or ignoring. But I'm back to KPIs here, because one absolute need is to make sure that this work that nature does for us is valorized. The assets that we today have for free, oil is for free. The fact that it has taken 100 million or 500 million years for the longer ones to create oil by nature comes for zero in the balance sheet of anyone, in the GDP of everyone. The only thing we pay or we valorize as GDP is the cost of extracting, refining and distributing this oil. The same for the carbon in the soil. So we absolutely need to find ways of putting value on these assets so that we can depreciate them, manage them, measure them, and embark the true economics of nature, or I would even say the true economics of life within our economics, in particular, of course, in this case in Europe. And the last point I would make is about human-centric. Obviously, there is, for me, it's really something of upper importance. Maybe I could start by saying that in my view, and I guess consensually probably, human dignity and happiness is really about the ability to feel that you have autonomy and social bonding and recognition. And I think the process of Industry 5.0 and innovation should both start and end with this, to test really how true we are to this idea in all the processes, the protocols, the decisions. Let me give 3 examples that, again, I've lived, frankly, in the company. Digital and AI is good, but I would overemphasize, I insist on overemphasize shop floor innovation. If you look at COVID, and that was said by Sandrine as well, local solutions were all over the place at Danone and so many other companies alike. We need things to be easy, flexible, to look also at lower tech innovation and support, over supporting that, because the nature of skin and things will be to go for the big, complex, huge kind of stuff, which is centralizing basically and leaving less autonomy at the end of the day for workers. And I think at the end of the day, less system resilience. The second point is about the fact that we all know that digital and AI will require a lot of reskilling and also a lot of restructuring. And I would not insist on this case here, but really we need to fight the market forces here, because if we don't, that will be terrible. Terrible for democracies, terrible for middle class, terrible for workers. At Danone, we've put in place a system before I left last year called Future Skills, which meant that nobody among the 20% less paid workers in any country in the world would be laid off by Danone in the next 2 years as part of the reskilling and the change and adaptation of the company to COVID. People would be reskilled on their job, entirely paid, get all their benefits for the next 2 years in order to be prepared to face with more resilience the next job market within the company or outside. This has now been extended in terms of the research to an important coalition that I'm co-chairing right now called Business for Inclusive Growth, which we have organized with the OECD and about 50 large multinational companies. It's hosted in Paris, which really is working at responsible restructuring. And I'm sure Sharan would develop on this, but I fundamentally think that this second aspect of the human centricity of our European policy is key. And the third one is workers' participation. It's like the obvious, and I can tell you in Danone we created a program called One Person, One Voice, One Share, which meant we consulted our employees on priorities, innovation, and others every year, once every year. And I think if I broaden the perspective, we should bring workers more in the governance. A human-centric European Union, for me, should embrace the freedom of association and unions as a competitive advantage versus models like the US model or the Chinese or Indian models. In a way, and that will be my conclusion, I think the competitive advantage of EU should not be measured only the same way as China or US measure their own competitive advantage. We have a distinct culture, a distinct history, a distinct future, a unique one. We are probably more of a social market economy overall. And I'm sure that if we all see the drawbacks, particularly as a business leader, we should also fully embrace the fundamental strength of a model like this one. And this would mean a much more resilient, if not as bright on some other KPIs, but who cares about being bright, provided there is more human dignity and, at the end of the day, citizen satisfaction in Europe. So thanks for inviting me, and happy to continue the conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Emmanuel. I was going to just ask you maybe a few follow-up questions, because Andrea and I had thought that it might be a good idea to build out and also into what Sharan will come in, because this was a perfect way to build towards Sharan's intervention. And I just had a couple of thoughts. First of all, you are so right that this constant deassociation of ourselves from nature and the world around us is what's killing us. And it's so clear that actually, when we see the economy today, this disassociation and the fact that we've continued to move towards GDP growth has actually created the first generation that's going to make less than its parents, because we are reaping the benefits of the resources that we have used rather than leaving that for the next generation. And we have a huge increase in mental health issues and in suicide rates. And one of the key issues that we also see is the disassociation between the real economy, which you mentioned so well, and the financial economy, which is truly squeezing and continuing to reap profits from the real economy. So I guess my question to you would be, and incredibly also because of your personal experience with predatory investors, and as you know, at the Club of Rome, we're trying to look at changing finance and the financial sector. You talk about criteria development, you talk about these important KPIs and these signals. What for you would be the most important thing to do now to decrease this squeezing effect of the profit mongering, I would say, financial sector that is not moving in the direction that we need to really uphold a well-being economy? What would be the singular shift, or maybe a few key examples of what you could see?
Well, that's a super hard question to answer in only a few minutes, Sandrine, but obviously a very important one. Maybe a couple of things I would say. Directionally, I think reintroducing viscosity in the financial markets, is a way to look at resilience. We've looked at market efficiency as, the ability to have extremely fast transactions, but now with algo trading, who knows really what, the value of that is. And I think we all know in the financial world that it actually increases the implied volatility, calculated as a formula. And the implied volatility means more volatility and therefore more risk. And then we don't measure the cost of managing that risk, which is a huge regulation that's needed, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas, as you and I have discussed already, we know people that are measuring the testosterone and cortisol of traders in the morning, and they're able to predict how much risk and profit they're going to make. So it's exactly the same point, that reconnecting the fact that humans are humans and traders are humans, would mean a completely different software, basically, to manage the way finance is operating. I think the deconstructing and localization of industry, of economies, basically, is also going to have a positive impact, because it will mean that less will depend and rely on global finance. And you know, this idea of viscosity is also one that we should think in terms of, you know, if you think about the food system, for instance, we all know that having a global food system is probably super efficient at one point in time, but super risky as well, because if there is a problem, there is a problem everywhere, as we've just seen with the COVID. And so this idea of relocalization, I think, is going to go in the right direction. Now, if I had one thing, I would push a regulation that would mean that for the financial market operators, i.e. debt and capital markets, the measurement of the underlying CO2 performance of their portfolio. Once there are metrics for large companies, and then it will trickle down to smaller ones, on what a scope 1, 2, 3 CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions is, then there is a very easy way to measure. As much as you measure the dollar evaluation of a portfolio, you measure the integrated weighted average time-based ownership on a given year or quarter for a portfolio manager of the underlying portfolio on CO2. And once you have that, you're able to make these people accountable, as much as we are more and more in the industry, with our brands and with stakeholders and unions and employees and consumers going at us for the right reasons. Make the people in the finance world accountable too, because once you have the KPI, you can have the incentive. And it's not going to be, and it's not going to solve the problem, but if you crack that on this CO2 thing, which I think is probably the one single, most simple and most advanced indicator that we can create and start playing with, it will be a crack in the wall. And then you can introduce many other indicators and do more regulation in this direction. And I think it will slow down also, because it will pace, it will allow finance to agree as well that an investment for climate in 2-3 years down the road is good for business, even if it is shortening profits for the immediate work.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point. And actually, just recently, I had a conversation, in fact, yesterday, on the fact that also you don't include offsetting within that. Those criteria cannot enable offsetting, as we've seen with also Johan Rockström's position with regard to the Shell case, and also obviously the final ruling. So that we don't then dig into, exactly as you've said in the past, how important those nature-based solutions are, but they're only used as an excuse for not actually truly investing in pulling out of fossil energy and high carbon energy.
And if I may add one thing more for our audience here working on these important topics, I think the fact that in the EU directives and policies coming on the Green Deal, the fact that we segregate the artificial and the natural carbon sink and look not at the net effect, but really the gross and net, is very, very important. And the more we will increase the natural carbon sinks objectives and targets, the more we will be able to work as well as beyond industry on this other big factor, which is agriculture, which, as we all know, net emissions are equivalent to industry overall. But the magic is that you don't get the oil, the carbon back into the oil pit where it belong to start with the process. Whereas agriculture, with agroecology, agroforestry, and regenerative agriculture, and many other things, and biodiversity positive agriculture, is actually able to redeploy the carbon in the soil, and therefore enhancing the soil health for the next generations of farming.
Yeah, very, very good points. I'm going to turn it back to you, Andrea, and I'm going to maybe put in as a caveat to what has just been said, that this proves why the taxonomy as well is so important. And the discussion that we're having right now in the Sustainable Finance Platform is that adaptation as well as mitigation and other objectives are as important, as is also the social taxonomy. So that's also a nice leeway to Sharan. So I'll pass it back to you, Andrea.
Yes, thank you very much. Fascinating conversation, and I think several ideas. I encourage the participants to start asking questions in the Q&A. There's already one question for for Emmanuel, but there will be, I'm sure, many more coming. Some other participants have posted some comments on the chat. And indeed, what gets measured gets done. It's also an expression that we use in the report on the industrial strategy that we released today, where we actually advocate for KPIs that really are not only about input and not only about supply side and not only about the single market as the ones that have been proposed so far by the Commission, but they are largely about impact, about what industry really generates in terms of impacts, in economic, social, and environmental terms, and the extension of the taxonomy, but also of many indicators that we have to the social dimension is extremely important. Indeed, Emmanuel was mentioning AI and all the hype and all the enthusiasm about AI-related innovation. Indeed, I've had quite a lot of experience in this field lately, having been a member of the high-level expert group of the EU on artificial intelligence. And I've been clear with other colleagues since the very beginning. We don't care about AI if AI does not lead us to a more a sustainable future. We care about it, and we are super excited about it if it really empowers humans and workers. So it is only about distinguishing the means from the ends, and I think this is something I'd like to ask Sharan, because I think her perspective in this is super important, and we need to come up with a good formula, with a good agenda for ensuring that the industrial strategy of the EU really respects the rights of workers, but not just protects workers, but empowers and transforms workers and lets them flourish in the new industrial environment. So, Sharan, over to you. It's not an easy task, but I'm sure you have great ideas about it.
Well, thank you, Andreas. I must say that I've really enjoyed listening to two of my favorite people. Sandrine's an incredible policy brain, but also works to support companies who want to make the difference, and is, of course, an incredible social advocate. And Emmanuel, well, he's just one of the most courageous CEOs I know, and indeed also a great social advocate and friend. So I think that you have already two incredible perspectives. I think the summary for me of this is that if we want a sustainable future that is just, inclusive, and resilient, then you have to have industry policy. You have to have an industrial strategy for all sectors that indeed builds justice, fairness, resilience, and is indeed environmentally friendly. You must have a new social contract. Workers need the trust of knowing that governments support a social contract with them, and they need to know their employer is respectful of this. And I want to come back to that. And of course, we need to have investment that has an ESG lens, a strong, if necessary, sanction-based ESG lens where that's not the case, because we can't afford to have a brown and a green economy anymore. We know it's very simple. It's an old adage of ours. There are no jobs on a dead planet. So we have to build those jobs, because the dignity of work is central to indeed 5.0 or a sustainable future, or whatever it is that you want to frame it as. So let's have a look at a few of those areas. First of all, on the jobs question, and I'll get to your technology piece. We have 5 central demands for a new social contract. One is jobs, jobs, and jobs. They have to be climate-friendly jobs, and they have to be with just transition, whether it's for climate transition and therefore energy as a base, but all technologies and the reuse or redeployment of materials used in a circular economy, or whether it's in fact technology. And I couldn't agree more that we cannot give in to technological determinism because people are simply excited by the technology, or they're going to make money from the technology. It has to actually be a foundation for resilience and for inclusiveness. In that context, then jobs are central to this. And we have a jobs target that sits at the heart of the dignity of work, because if you think we have a broken labour market, 60% of our labour force is informal, no rights, no formal protection at all, no social protection, no rule of law. So that's survival every day. But that leaves only 40% in the formal economy. And even there, a third of these jobs are insecure, they're precarious, they don't need to be. It's not about flexibility. It's actually about human dignity, human rights, and indeed the regulation of the labour market. And so if you think about the jobs gap, if we want full employment, and that's the tenet of the social stability that grew out of the ILO, created after World War I, reinforced by the Philadelphia Declaration after 2 World Wars and a Great Depression, then full employment is indeed requires in the formal sector around 575 million jobs. Now, that's only in the 40%. We also have a target, which is vital to meet the SDGs, of at least half of the informal economy, which would be 1 billion jobs. Work that's formal for 1 billion workers. And there's ways in which you can, irrespective of the orthodoxy and the views of people around labour or business models, whether it's platform economy or whatever, we can clean up the deficit in those jobs. But if we think about the deployment of technology, if we think about it integrated with indeed climate sustainability, then there are jobs in investment in every sector, because we're very clear, every sector has to transition. And I'm with Sandrine. We can't make excuses about those who want to be laggards in this, because apart from the damage it will do to the economy, if you argue that, well, we're a transition technology and we can deploy, you know, CCS or dirty hydrogen or whatever for a long period of time with no regulation about maximum emissions. Despite that, it's actually lying to workers. You can't ask them to make this transition and then in another 10 or 15 years be forced to make another one and pretend that the trust will be there. So jobs sit at the heart of it, but so too does labour being part of the design, the innovation, trusting it, and of course, community renewal. The second one is about rights, and we need to have a fair competition floor of rights and environmental standards. So multilateral reform with the WTO front and centre, all bilateral trade agreements, you know, the CBAM mechanism fits into that in terms of industry policy development, but it's also about the business model. And here I want to pay tribute to Emmanuel because he walked the talk. There's a number of businesses that I work with, that Sandrine works with, indeed, Business for Inclusive Growth that Emmanuel founded and co-chairs, which I'm proud to be a part of. They're not telling you they have all the answers. What they're saying is they have a value set and they're working together to see how they can act on it. Whether it's a rights floor, whether it's mandated due diligence with grievance procedures to effect remedy, whether it's a minimum living wage. These companies and others are making the transition. Emmanuel has been an incredible model leader in that. And what you saw, from my perspective, in the battle around Danone was the battle for the corporate model. And it comes back to your point around Europe, or it might have been Emmanuel's point around social Europe. I've watched as an outsider. I'm now an adopted European citizen for a decade now, but outside of this, when I was in Australia leading the labour movement, we used to put our heads in our hands and see this battle between the European social model, where workers were respected. There was legislation. There's even co-determination models in Germany. There were works councils. You know, all of these things have kind of problems in terms of management, but they are about human dignity. And the American corporate model. And that battle is still going on. And I very much see the stakeholder versus shareholder model as part of that continuing struggle. And then, of course, we think there's no excuse for not having mandated due diligence for both rights and for surveillance. And finally, if we don't have two other elements, we'll never get an inclusive future. And the two other elements are universal social protection a mix of government guarantees and indeed for resilience as a resilient floor, and of course contributory systems or deferred wages bargained for and so on. But there's also, and I might just add, 73% of the world's people have little or no social protection. So this is a fundamental challenge for the global community. And the next one is, of course, equality. It is about income equality, but it's also about gender and race. And unless we deal with those questions, we can't actually meet the test. I would just say on income equality, if you want to look at the breaking down, in developed economies, of course, but the beginning of the smashing of the social contract, it was hyper-globalization and the dream of simply, you know, the more money we make, the better off everybody will be. And labour income share since the 80s, and that hyper-globalization has been like a big roller coaster, just like a big dipper going down. So I would simply say that unless investment is generated and indeed scrutinised with those things in mind, with secure innovation, industry policy, you know, with a 5.0 lens, as you say, where people, planet and prosperity sit at the heart, we will lose. We will lose. So we have to fight for it. But I would say that, you know, Sandrine and I work with the Wellbeing Alliance, and those governments, small, led by women mainly, who are in fact saying not just do we want different indicators, but we're going to be accountable for the things that our citizens tell us they want us to govern around, as well as, of course, as Sandrine and Emmanuel said, the global growth indicators that are way beyond GDP. So we have work to do, but it's not hard for us to have a shared set of values and to take them into whatever industry, sector, policy setting, regulatory environment that we are part of.
Thanks a lot, Sharan. This is loud and clear. I think it's also very much in line with what has been said by the other speakers. And there are ways around this, but it's very difficult to come with a policy mix, or at least with a set of priorities and a sequence of policy actions that can get us there as quickly as possible. Sometimes it seems like, I don't know if you agree with me, that we're stuck a little bit in a chicken and egg sort of type of dilemma, right? Do you change finance first? Do you change the organization of firms first, and then finance will follow? And indeed, in many cases, it probably would just take political will to set the priorities and lead the change. So this is where probably government is an inevitable ally of the private sector and an inevitable champion of change and transformation going forward, together with civil society. Now, I'd like to open the floor to questions. There are some questions in the Q&A, so some of them are clearly addressed to some of the speakers. But what I'd like to do, it's a little bit of a surprise for you, but since we are mostly talking about future generations, right? We at CEPS have selected 3 fantastic young thinkers that every morning this week talk about the future of democracy in the EU, and many of them are actually deeply interested in this topic. So I turn to my colleague Hien Vu, who will introduce 2 of these young thinkers who have questions to ask. So let's hear their questions.
Thank you, Andrea. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Hien Vu. I am the researcher at the Policy Evaluation Unit at CEPS. So today I'm happy to bring in 2 young researchers from the Young Thinker Initiative. And this initiative is implemented in collaboration with the Trigger project. So it is a project led by the GRID unit at CEPS. And we aim to connect the young minds with today's leaders, stimulate debate, and envision the future of Europe. So in total, we have 30 young thinkers taking part in joint activities. And this week, they have been working intensively together on the topics related to the future of Europe and citizen engagement. So without further ado, I'm glad to give the floor to these 2 young thinkers, Dario Moreira and Alliance Nishishena. So any one of you who wants to go first?
Yeah. Let's pick Dario, who was the first one to express the interest first. And Dario, you should be able to take the floor and ask your question.
Yes.
No? Yes, here's Dario.
It's working. Hi, so I'm Dario. Thank you so much for this talk. It's been extremely informative. not a topic that I had a background in. So it's been really illuminating in a lot of aspects. And I've heard a lot of things that I wouldn't expect from a former CEO of a multinational, if I may say it so myself. One question that I'd like to explore is this dichotomy that Sharan just alluded to between the European social model and the American corporate model, which I think sometimes might oversimplify things. And so I would just like to hear everyone's opinion on the mechanisms through which we want to finance these investments that we're talking about. I think the ideas of unions as a competitive advantage and reforming KPIs are extremely enticing, but equally, the idea of a corporate tax seems very productive for this end as well. And this is something that the US, the Biden administration, has pioneered, and the EU has been rather reluctant to endorse. So sort of just exploring this, the nature of how to deal with capitalism in the medium term. Thank you.
Thank you a lot, Dario. Should we move to Allianz? If we can connect to her. Let's see if we can get her on screen for her question, and then we will.
Hello.
Hello, Allianz. Here you are.
Hi, my name is Lyons, and I work as a researcher as an electrical engineer for the Spanish National Research Council. So I'm very happy to be able to ask my question to such a distinguished panel and a diverse panel today. The question I want to answer is particularly in terms related to the Next Generation EU initiative, where one of their pillars is scale up. So it's the idea that the European Union wants to establish themselves more in the industry of data, cloud, and particularly cutting edge processors in semiconductors. And this is a lot within digital devices. But I find this a bit of a contradiction because to be able to be competitive in such a market, you have to secure a lot of cheap supply, particularly cobalt, gold, and cobalt. So these materials have a very unethical, exploitative, and high emission supply chain. So quoting what Sandrine said today, that we should push for global prosperity for all, I'm curious to know, so in this Industry 5.0 plan, in the scenario where Europe is the leading body, in a world where we are increasingly more dependent on digital devices, what strategies should the EU apply to defeat companies' current financial incentives to continue these toxic supply chains? So that's kind of just the conversation and dialogue that I would like to open up for. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me see who of the speakers wants to tackle. Perhaps Sandrine, you want to start with the last question and take this. I think it was inspired by some of your considerations. Then I will see whether any of the other two speakers want to take Dario's question on the American versus European approach to capitalism and the role of taxation. So Sandrine, I'll turn over to you.
Perfect, and thank you, Allianz, for an excellent question. And I couldn't agree with you more. And I think that this is very deep, right? I mean, we could start with, for example, debt issues and the way in which we are indebted, we in the West, to Southern resources, the fact that we haven't decoupled. There are some really big tensions here that we need to address if we're going to look at Industry 5.0, before even getting to a point around whether we ensure that we scale up digitalization at the European level. The rare earths issue is a huge issue, and we cannot continue to pillage the rest of the resources of the rest of the world without giving either due consideration for the planet or due consideration for the people that are exploited within those mines, or due consideration for the real trickle-down effect of real wealth distribution, which we know doesn't happen. So my answer to your question is that we need to understand that there are a series of border tax adjustment, a series of ways in which we need to look at trade agreements, the way in which we look at commodities, and which commodities, as we said through us here, part of our paper will be looking at the redundancy of some value chains. There's also a real key discussion right now around minerals and mining, which is I'm even having with the Secretary General of Eurométaux, the metals Organization for Europe. And there it's, should we be opening up more mines in Europe? Should we actually shift our dependency on the rest of the world and potentially look at our own production? Now, obviously, there are huge impacts there, biodiversity impacts and other impacts. But so, yes, to come back to your question, Industry 5.0, as I said, is not about replacing the current model. It's about a total paradigm shift. It's about looking at the way in which we depend on others, the way in which we foster other economies to be the same as our own towards a well-being economy, and the way in which we pay back our debts. And that, of course, also, and Mampela Ramfele, who is clearly my co-president at the Club of Rome, will say we have to think about post-colonial relationships and what we do to pay back our debts and really shift our dependency on certain value chains. So thank you for that question, and I'll allow the others to then answer the others as well.
Thank you very much, Sandrine. Indeed, the post-colonial issue and the need to revisit that is something that has emerged also during the first day of our Ideas Lab. And I had the honor to moderate another panel as phenomenal as this one. And I asked Joe Stiglitz, what have we learned from the pandemic on economics, right? On the future of our economic thinking. And he said, well, we certainly have learned that we have to deal with externalities a lot more, right? And we need to care about this much more and be much more serious about it. And this applies to vaccine solidarity. It applies to resilience in healthcare as much as it applies to raw materials and all the value chains. And the idea of due diligence along supply chains and really changing the incentives, also what governs the incentive, whether to externalize production or not, and at what conditions, and to building a much more sustainable and level playing field in this respect, I think is a very important idea that could potentially be championed by many at the planetary level. We hope with Sandrine and I for sure, and many of you also, that we can amplify these messages as much as possible and build as big as possible, as large as possible, a coalition around these ideas.
Can I just?
Yes, Sharan,
Can
please.
I just add a perspective to the supply chain issue? There's absolutely no doubt that this is able to be fixed with due diligence and with a set of rules, very clear rules. This year is the elimination of child labour, the UN year for the elimination of child labour. If you look at the supply chains for the supply of the vital technology components, then child labour is everywhere. Some forced labour, but mostly child labour in many settings. You can eradicate it with political will, but also with corporate action. And on the cost factor, people will tell you time and time again the myth of what would be a few cents. If you look at what these, a decent job, a minimum living wage would cost, a few cents at best on a small component of technology. And you could actually create decent work. So it's possible. We just need the will and the partnerships to make that happen. And of course, and there is a group called the Responsible Mining Initiative, where, companies at least are committed to doing this. So let's see if we can work with them. Just on the simplistic nature of Europe versus American models, I totally agree. It is simplistic. And there are many American companies, well, not as many as we'd like, but indeed, as Emmanuel will tell you, trying to move to public benefit companies, looking at stakeholder models, but often it's the language. And when you look at the rules and the guidance around what this looks like, it still needs reform because it's hard to shift a culture that was all about maximizing profit without realizing that everybody, I said to somebody the other day, if you don't have workers with just wages so they can actually spend in the economy, you don't have an economy. There's no way without a real economy you can keep making the profits on agriculture and mining and, even health and education, sadly, these days, and so on. So we definitely need to make sure that the model has a social heart with the appropriate regulation and, of course, with environmental sustainability.
Thanks a lot, Sharan. I see that Jean-Luc has joined us, which is fantastic, very timely. Jean-Luc, you see we're having a very rich discussion for more than an hour now, and with the also contributions from two young researchers that have asked very, very good questions. I asked Emmanuel if he had comments on those questions to perhaps wait until Jean-Éric has finished his speech, and then maybe I give you the floor so that you can also react to Jean-Éric, so that we bring Jean-Éric into the conversation, and then we give a chance to everybody to respond. So Jean-Éric, thanks for joining us. I give you the floor. We've been discussing the paradigm of Industry 5.0 and the many challenges that we see currently in EU institutions and at the global level to really mainstream this paradigm and really make it a blueprint for a more inclusive and sustainable and resilient approach to industrial development. So I give you the floor to also give us your point of view on how far can the Industry 5.0 approach go inside the Commission and beyond. Thanks for being with us, Jean-Éric.
Andrea, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks a lot for accommodating my constraints this afternoon. I apologize to the other panelists for crashing the meeting elegantly as I'm doing now. Andrea, yes, Industry 5.0 is, I find, conceptually a rather powerful concept with this notion of human-centric sustainable industry. It is being discussed as a concept, I note, with the CEPS Ideas Lab of this year, and with the great participation in this panel in a much broader setup than just the Commission. But at this stage, it remains a conceptual instrument, which in fact echoes, I think, a broader paradigm shift in public policies worldwide, certainly in Europe and certainly in EU institutions, which is to deploy systemic strategies to deal with our sustainability challenges, whilst allowing our societies to thrive. So that systemic approach has led the Commission to prioritize as its cardinal strategic direction the European Green Deal, which is presented politically, and this is certainly very powerful. Whether this is entirely operational is certainly a matter of progress still. But this green strategy, this green transformation of our continent, both on climate and biodiversity challenges, is Europe's growth strategy. So the notion that you can grow an economy with sustainability is not entirely new, but I think it was a little bit of a narrative more than a reality. I think what we are now trying to do through a number of policy initiatives, regulations, investment priorities, and of course research and innovation is entirely geared towards that ambition, providing systemic solutions, allowing that green transformation to happen fast and deeply, and that then permeates, if you want, many, and ideally it will over time permeate all our policies. Industry policy, therefore, as well, very, very visibly. I think there is already a lot to be said in terms of concrete developments. You have across the Commission work happening between teams in many sectors of industry. You know of the ecosystem approach, which the Commission is now putting forward in the industry strategy. It's an ecosystem approach around the green and digital transformations, of course, with recovery and building a resilient societies very much at the heart of it after the pandemic, but keeping completely the cardinal direction of that green transformation. So we will see, I think, sector by sector, very tangible progress in this European public policy framework. You can see that in partnerships promoted in research on the Horizon Europe. The Clean Aviation Partnership, for example, has been a very, very challenging, difficult, but also very ambitious discussion between industry and Commission on what we want to achieve in aviation. And we agreed in the end that the only purpose of that partnership is to create the range of aircraft by 2027, to develop them, to allow them then to enter into the market in the 30s and allow zero emission, essentially zero emission aviation by 2050. I mean, a long-term vision, but with then here this a very concrete partnership, which is, of course, in the times the aviation industry is confronted today, a little bit asynchronic. but reflects, I think, a strong bid from public policies, but also matched, I find, increasingly, and I will say a brief word on that now, matched increasingly also by industry. I'm sure that Emmanuel was certainly quite interesting in showcasing how he tried indeed to work around a human-centric industrial development, which has many facets, starting obviously within the company, but then the impact on society, including with the environment. We are seeing this now increasingly. It is not yet across the board. I think many players, probably a majority of players around institutions, remain very often more on the narrative and less on the operational transformation which needs to come with it. I think that is a matter of time. I don't think it's necessarily completely problematic, but we don't have much time, as Sandrine certainly argued when she spoke. So we need to, with concepts like Industry 5.0, really continue to push across the system in a systemic way to ensure that policies and actors are not just aligning themselves in a narrative, slightly adjusting course, maybe locking themselves into technologies which will then not cut it towards 2050, and Industry 5.0 will help us. And I finish with one last dimension, which is also now increasingly pervasive across our policy making, which is the work with society and citizens. I mean, this is of course nothing new in Europe and of course around the world. We work for society ultimately, but I think what is now new in research policy certainly, but around the conference on the future of Europe, I hope we will see more of that, is to find ways and means to work with citizens, not just to tell them how great our solutions are, but to design the solutions with citizens. And that's a completely different exercise. I mean, the methods or the techniques to do that exist. They are not rocket science. We are testing them, for example, on the Horizon Europe missions around soils or cities. The real challenge is not the technique. The challenge is to ensure that we listen, that the citizens really have a place to co-design, because this not only better policies. I mean, collective intelligence based in society is a better policy. Of course, citizens in isolation are not going to do it properly either, so you need that co-design effort. But with that, if you then make this done on a wider basis and visible enough, I would argue also then brings ownership in society, and all these transformations in industry, in and around the Green Deal are essentially and ultimately around society changing by picking up technologies, but also by deeply changing the way as humans we operate and the way we interact in society. So therefore also this is a key shift in the way policies are considered and designed, not yet mainstream, but increasingly so. And here Industry 5.0 certainly provides an interesting framework as well. I hope I was short enough. Thanks, Andrea.
Yeah, no, you never. I mean, you could have been even longer. There's no problem, Jean-Éric. I might want to provoke you a little bit before I give the floor to Emmanuel, because we've seen the communication on the update of the industrial strategy. You in the past have been very, been working inside the Commission also on better regulation. Jean-Éric, I'm very passionate for the EU, and this is not only myself. Most of the speakers certainly are in this panel. I was a little bit disappointed by the fact that the update of the industrial strategy did not go, as far as promoting a more alignment with sustainability and resilience. I was also a little bit disappointed that the communication on better regulation announced the possible reorientation towards the Sustainable Development Goals, but was quite shy in that respect. So my question is, do you think you'll have to convince first your colleagues in the Commission about Industry 5.0 and then conquer the rest of the world? And how do you think, what do you think is the best way to go about it? If yes, obviously.
Mm-hmm. Well, how should I put it? I think the industry policy communication and the better regulation communication are only frameworks. They don't do anything. They provide a policy framework within which we now need to deliver this human-centric, sustainable policy effort with industry, but also, of course, in other areas of human activity as well. So I'm personally not so put off by the fact that this is not maybe as spectacular as it could have ideally been. I'm not saying that it could not have been better. I mean, this is a policy paper by a political institution which makes a number of choices and needs also to bring together a number of angles. And there are certainly angles which some of our partners would have liked to see a bit more prominent, but they are all there. So the challenge is now not so much about these two papers, which are here and there, it's to use them. And I think in better regulation, it is really now up to Commission services, but also up to our interlocutors and partners to, when we devise now the specific policy initiatives, to use those new frameworks, improved frameworks, and push us towards regulations which are really moving the cursor in the right direction. The instrument allows the cursor to be moved quite a bit in the right direction, and it's not going to be easy, don't get me wrong, but this is where now I think the work needs to be done. Within the Commission, there is a very, very large, I would think there's a very large consensus across Commission services. My peers, but the entire setup in the Commission has really shifted with the Green Deal strategy. I mean, this was, of course, a result of a process of the new Commission coming into play, of the Greta Thunberg effect as well at the time. And this was a paradigm shift, and we are not going back on it a minute. And the fact, Andrea, just the fact that in the recovery and resilience strategies, we have from the outset said, yes, we have a pandemic. Yes, we are in an economic crisis, which is probably unprecedented, even against 2008, 2012, but still, we want to focus the strategies and policies not just on growth in the classical sense of the word, but on these green and digital transformation. So this is why I'm not so worried. But you need to help us. This is not going to happen in isolation. And Sandrine is helping quite vocally for her part, I must say. And I think it is not always easy to maybe listen to for some of my colleagues, but I'm always very comfortable when there is a constructive criticism, and obviously the way this is articulated by Sandrine in her Club of Rome responsibilities, but also in her responsibilities for ESIR, I find that extraordinarily helpful.
Thanks a lot. You can be sure about this that we, Sandrine and I, and certainly Sharan and Emmanuel will continue to push for to help you in this respect. So Emmanuel, long overdue. I give you the floor. You're free to comment on anything that you have heard until now.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you, Jean-Eric, for popping it in the conversation so timely. I'll be brief. I think maybe to Dario's question. First of all, let's indeed not be so simplistic about the US versus EU social versus capitalist model. I think at the corporate level, things are pretty different. If I just use again the example of Danone, we acquired a company for about $12 billion 4 years ago, so a pretty big company in the US. It only took 2 years for the employees of this company to unionize. It was a Texas-based company and Colorado-based, so pretty, anti-union kind of background, but with the appropriate skills and management, opening, etc. 2 years. So just 2 years, and we didn't do that because we think we are better people morally. We just did that because we believe that having union is a competitive advantage. It comes with a lot of challenges, but it comes with opportunities that are, in our way of managing things, we believe are way beyond the challenges and complexity. So that's one thing. The other thing is echoing also what Sharan said about the fact that the US have actually been quicker than the EU on picking on things like public benefit corporations, entreprises à mission, purpose-driven companies, B Corps, etc. The first time I visited that kind of business was in 2010 in California, and you start to have, like Danone, who became an entreprise à mission last year with 99% support of shareholders. The same happened to a very big health tech company in the US, $40 billion capitalization, who, through their AGM, adopted the status of public benefit corporation. So things are also moving on that side in the US. This is why I think it's urgent for even more countries in the EU, like France, the UK, Italy, Portugal, etc., Netherlands, to come up with their own model and hopefully a convergent model of purpose-driven companies, because I really believe that purpose and meaning is going to be a competitive advantage for Europe. And we can't let the US, with their magnificent entrepreneurship, to be the leaders in that field. The second aspect I'd say is that we should be consistent with what we really believe. Let me take very briefly the example of carbon in the soil. As I explained, it's very important for the resilience of agriculture, as much as biodiversity, including in agriculture, seeds diversity, varieties, etc., for the health of soil. So putting carbon in the soil is very, very important for the future food stability and sovereignty of Europe. So I fully support the carbon border adjustment mechanisms that have been discussed, and I really think they should be put in place, because there's no way that deforesting high carbon emitting soil from Brazil is going to come into Europe at the same price as the soy that would be grown locally in Europe. So let's be very clear on this. There is no reason that wouldn't be the case. And it's too short for me to explain here, but I'm absolutely clear on the fact that there is a resilient agriculture that can grow within Europe, dealing with and trading with the rest of the world with those carbon adjusted and deforestation and biodiversity adjusted mechanisms. The last thing I'd say on this is there was a book that was published, I think, 30 years ago by Michael Porter at Harvard Business School, called The Competitive Advantage of Nations. I still read that book, and I still believe it's a fundamental basis for what we should be doing. And to push or send the ball back to many of you around this audience, I think politicians and policy making is part of building an ecosystem that makes a competitive advantage, of course. So let's make sure, and I'm confident that the Green Deal that Jean-Eric was referring to, the recovery plans, etc., the way Europe did that is also a competitive advantage, and we should really be looking at building this as a competitive advantage for our nations in Europe.
Thanks a lot, Emmanuel. And indeed, also with Jean-Eric, and we've been discussing for quite a long time the role of public policy and regulation for innovation. I mean, giving direction to innovation. And connected with us in the audience, we have an academic that has actually started to write even a decade before Michael Porter about the positive role of regulation for innovation, and you can see his comments in the chat. It is Nicholas Ashford from the MIT, who was the first one to actually prove that and argue very convincingly that regulation can be a blessing for innovation if it adequately stringent time then gives the proper direction towards addressing societal challenges. So greetings to Nick, that has been prolific also in the chat, as he normally is in the papers. I'd like, as we are coming very close to a wrap up, I'd like to give the floor to Sharan, and then perhaps ask Sandrine to give her final thoughts. It's been a fascinating conversation. It is time to wrap up. So Sharan, any additional comments that you might have? We are eager to listen to you.
No, I just want to say that this is the conversation we need to have, and we need to have all the actors at the table, because unless we can build trust in a pathway that is transparent, that people in communities, that industry leaders, that unions and workers and community leaders affected actually understand what the path to a sustainable future is, then you won't build the trust. And we won't build confidence in our democracies unless we actually deal with building trust and making not just the industry policy transparent, that's critical, but also the nature of accountability and well-being transparent. So we're all in it. Let's find the tables that actually get us to the regulatory and the corporate model that works.
Thanks a lot, Sharan. It's been an extreme pleasure to have you with us and hearing your thoughts. I turn to Sandrine for her final comments.
Well, it's always hard to give final comments after Sharan because she always brings such depth and beauty to this discussion. And I really want to commend Sharan in particular. I don't think we all can really understand the amount of work that this one woman has done to transform the entire unions in really supporting a just transition. So for me, it's a heartfelt thank you to you, Sharan, for your incredible work. To Emmanuel for his continued important leadership that even if no longer with Danone will shine a light on what a real CEO looks like. And I think that is fundamental. And to Jean-Éric, who joined us by saying, thank you for having trust in myself as chair of ASIR and the experts for allowing us to have that debate and to test you and to push you. And I will close with this, Andrea, which is that we have seen time and time again that parts of the European Commission, and I tend to agree with you, there are still silos within the Commission. There are silos within our ministries in different countries across Europe and across the globe. That exists. The question now is, one, how do we break down those silos? And coming to the very important point that was made by Nicholas, around the fact that there is an elite. How do we change that elite? What does that elite become? Can that elite become an elite that truly believes in people, planet, and prosperity and realizes with great humility that it is the universe that is bigger than us, that it is the eco that actually should dictate the ego rather than the ego, the eco? And I think that's the key question, because an elite that is an enlightened elite that is truly servicing people, planet, and prosperity, that's okay for me. But an elite that has forgotten their role as a leadership, as an enlightened leader that is only trying to pursue their own profit and their own self-worth and gain is not okay, especially in the midst of a planetary emergency. So Sharan, to your important point of where do we go next and how do we continue to have conversations like this one, we have proposed to the European Commission and DG Research and Innovation to actually build on this very conversation and ensure that we have greater amount of dialogues all through the autumn to truly unpack the tensions around Industry 5.0. To ensure that we do truly look at all the angles of what it means to be a player within this new paradigm shift, and that we bring in the different perspectives and look at where the solutions are and how we can shift. So we have no time. We know that there is a community of actors that want to work together. The key question now is how do we bring more people on the journey and ensure that we do it together and that it's not just a top-down approach, but it becomes an all of society approach so that we can actually get to where we need to go. And you see my ta-ta missile right behind me. And as many of you have heard me say before, our mission is not to the moon. Our mission is to ensure that we preserve the planet that we so dearly love. And that is going to be, I'm sure all of us will join that mission, and hopefully we'll have many more. So thank you for this great conversation. Once again, very inspirational and very real. And let's continue to have more real conversations and come up with the right impacts and solutions.
Thanks a lot, Sandrine. We're coming to an end of our session. We've seen elements of many things that you have on screen. Certainly the rocket ship and the mission element that Sandrine has. Knowing the sports passion of two of the speakers here, I think we are facing either a long bicycle ride or a steep climb in the case of Emmanuel. But I think if we do this together and we continue this conversation, we can come to redefining a little bit the boundaries of what's possible in policy terms. I'd like to thank you all. I'd like to thank also our young thinkers and also all of you who have asked questions. I've seen that the speakers have also answered some of the questions that have left pending in the chat. We continue this conversation in the Research and Innovation Days with another panel organized by the ASIR group, and we will have more, and we will try to involve more and more of you in this fascinating discussion. So thanks a lot. Have a good continuation of the afternoon, and talk soon.
And thank you, Andrea. Thank you.
Merci à tous.
Merci.
Merci.